Who is the worst kind of person to be sat next to on a long flight? Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy. Thanks. Story 1. I'd take a big person over a smelly person. Nothing is worse than someone who smells like us and you're trapped. Total violation of the senses. Story 2. Someone who is hell-bent on chatting when your whole demeanor screams leave me alone. Story 3. Smelly person. I mean, I don't think there's anything you can do about it while on the plane. Story 4. Definitely someone who talks non-stop or takes up all the armrest space. Story 5. An older woman wearing the most foul-smelling perfume my nose has smelled. It was a 9-hour flight. I felt like throwing up from my headache a few hours in. Story 6. Terrorists. Story 7. I once had the people behind me change their toddler's poopy diaper right there at the seat, and oh god, it was awful. We all turned the vents on to blow it away, but it was pretty futile. People were gagging. Story 8. A sick person. Story 9. Look, this isn't the worst per se, but until this happened, it wasn't even something I would have considered before. On a long flight aka land, LAX, I was sitting at the back of a 777 on the sides, so there were only 2 seats. The guy next to me was a very pleasant and interesting Brit. We talked for a while. He explained that at that time it was cheaper to fly to the Caribbean, buy a boat, and then sail it back to NZ than it was to just buy it there, so that's what he was doing. But, as you'd expect on a 14-plus-hour flight, eventually the lights dim and nearly everyone sleeps. Here's my problem with this guy that I liked up to that point. He was a snuggler. I woke up 3 times during that flight with him dead asleep on my shoulder and snuggling with my arm, his hand in my armpit. The fact that he was a heavy sleeper, I pushed him off me all 3 times, and it didn't even seem to impact his sleep in the least, probably made things even worse for me. At the end of the flight, his attitude and demeanor hadn't changed in the least, so I sincerely doubt he even knew what he'd done. Story 10. The guy who chokes to drinks and then sleeps snoring loudly for the entire flight. It's me. Hi. I'm the problem. It's me. Story 11. A screaming baby. Story 12. Gonna get flamed. Fat people who are sat in their seat and in half of yours. Story 13. Sat next to a woman who coughed the entire flight and wouldn't wear a mask. 3 days later, I get COVID. Story 14. A child with inattentive parents. Story 15. People who don't wear headphones. Story 16. I recently sat by a girl who kept blowing her snotty nose into her fingers. Story 17. A tall person with really long legs. I realize it's not their fault, but I don't like being touched, and having to sit through a flight with someone's knees pressed against mine is not fun. Story 18. There was a guy on one of the travel Reddits arguing that if his leg space is a little too small because of the way the row in front of him's seat legs are bolted to the floor, he should be able to put his feet on the other side of those seat legs in his neighbor's foot space, so probably that guy. Story 19. My mother, she will talk your ear off. Get your phone number and try to meet up you in the future when you've long forgotten about her. Story 20. Go in with an unusual answer, but an attractive woman. Every guy in the area tries to strike up a conversation with her, and it's the most boring stuff to listen to. Story 21. An obese person who overflows into your space. Story 22. Sitting in the airport right now killing time before a flight, and these responses are making me nervous. We were only halfway through boarding group 2 when the lady at the desk announced that there was no more space in the overhead compartment, and everyone from about 10 people in front of me on had to check anything that wouldn't fit under the seat. I get on board and get in my seat, and lo and behold, there's all sorts of empty space in the overhead compartments. I don't even care that the flight was delayed and I'm home late, but that shit made me livid. Story 24. Heavy smoker who oozes nicotine stank from every pore. Story 25. It was 1982. I was 48. They were 9 months. It was my lifelong dream vacation to see my beloved Buckingham Palace, and my goal was to make one of the Queen's Guard laugh. I was so tired when I got off the plane that I couldn't think of anything funny to say. Story 26. An obese person with poor personal hygiene. Story 27. I am totally okay understanding that you can't completely control when a baby cries. What you can control is how you're reacting to it. I've seen awful parents on planes who will bitch and nag at their own child for crying, saying stuff like, "Oh my god, please just stop. Shut up. Why are you even crying, bro? You chose to have this baby. You chose to bring them on a plane." I doubt being angry with them will make them calm down. Kind parents who softly shush and comfort their crying child are way better than bullying parents. Second worst is someone who disregards hygiene before jumping on board. Story 28. I was flying back home from a work conference in Denver once. I had a hangover from socializing the night before, but was otherwise in a good mood. The plane was delayed, and while waiting at the gate the lady next to me struck up a conversation. She was wearing a cat cardigan, cat paw print leggings, a cat backpack, and cat earrings, and she was carrying a book about cats. She told me she'd been in Denver for a cat show. Who knew that was a thing? She was nice enough, but definitely eccentric, and would not stop talking. Eventually we were allowed to board, and she sat right next to me. On boarding she picked up a carry crate containing her cat, which she slid under her seat. I was not aware you could do this. Again, who knew? She tried to keep talking incessantly about cats, and normally I'd be polite and at least half listen and nod, but my hangover was getting worse, so after 30 minutes or so I put my headphones in and proceeded to ignore her. Soon after we hit some turbulence. Her poor show cat, whose name I've since forgotten, peed everywhere. The smell of cat urine pushed my hangover into migraine territory, prompting a visit to the airplane toilet to vomit. The cat proceeded to meow and wail the duration of the flight. Definitely my worst flight experience. Story 30. Not being cruel, but this happened to me. Autistic person with spastic CP. I felt for the guy, but the constant slamming against the seat and yelling were a bit much for me. I worked with autistic adults for 30 years, so I smiled and did not complain, but think the staff should have researched a handicap seat or harness for the man. Story 32. Someone who doesn't have headphones when you're trying to read a new book you've been saving for this specific flight. Story 33. I was taking my girlfriend to London and this guy sat next to me and he started making small talk. Eventually it got weird, and he told me that I sat next to him on a flight to London with my mom when I was a baby, and he had saved up his whole life to go to London and try to make the royal guard laugh, but because I cried so much he couldn't rest and was too tired to make them laugh, and since then he's waited and waited for his revenge, and so he dug through my trash and found my itinerary. I think he got bit by a rat, but he said it wasn't gross, and he said he was gonna cry the whole flight. He started to yell, and then the flight attendant said he was in the wrong seat, and he asked why he couldn't just pick his seat, because you can at some concerts, but they made him move. The rightful owner of the seat accidentally stepped in the way. He had to go to get to his seat and he got mad, but he eventually took his seat. After that I listened to music, and the next day my girlfriend and I had our dream London vacation. Story 35. Your ex who cheated on you. Story 36. An influencer. Story 37. Talkers. People who want to chat with me. Look, I just want to eat my 7 tiny pretzels and then take an uncomfortable nap. Don't tell me how you support my life choices because of your niece named Poon in Minneapolis. Don't ask me about my tattoos. Don't ask me what line of work I'm in. And if I wanted a joke, I'd follow you into the John and watch you take a leak. What kind of name is Poon anyway? Story 38. From Hawaii to LA. I sat next to a guy wearing a small tank top and shorts who had clearly wiped out on a skateboard the previous day. Body was covered in road rash that was oozing the entire time. He just picked at all his wounds. Scabs oozed the entire flight. Story 39. I travel with earplugs, so even crying babies don't much bother me. My friend was on a flight where he was required by the flight attendant to lift his armrest because the morbidly obese passenger next to him couldn't fit in his own seat. So the entire flight he had a fat arm, hip and leg pressed against him. For me, the worst is a smelly person. Please shower and or take a Beano before flying. Story 41. A chatty religious person with Ebola, COVID, the plague, lice, with a crying child who has projectile air sickness, or an influencer. Story 42. The guy I sat next to on a 14-hour flight that whipped out a bag of shelled pistachios right when we got on and proceeded to crack and eat them for the whole flight. Between the noise of the cracking, the soft shell pieces flying everywhere, and him sucking the shells and licking his fingers, I'm surprised I didn't end up tackled by Air Marshal and hauled off at the nearest stop. Story 44. A person who gets up every 5 minutes. Story 45. 2 large Albanian women with excruciatingly severe body odor. Story 46. The worst person I've ever sat next to decided to cut a sandwich with chopsticks. Took them a solid 4 minutes of sawing while elbowing me to get through it. For being a small person they somehow managed to be constantly in my personal space, and later on cried and screamed like a child when the flight attendant took their drink from them due to rough turbulence. I stayed on the flight at the connection, and the flight attendant came up after she had gotten off the plane and apologized to me. Story 47. loud kids and babies. Story 48. I don't care what someone looks like, their body and health are their business. But on a flight home last year, I was seated away from my partner in a window seat, very much not a fan. I prefer aisle, next to a man who was easily over 400 pounds. I was afraid the poor wisp of a woman in the aisle seat was going to pop out of the row like a tiddlywink when the plane started moving, because she was already leaning out into the aisle just to be able to sit fully over on my side. My ass was shoved up against the wall of the plane, literally half sideways, just so I could take a full breath. I think the flight attendant saw the panic I was feeling, because she told the woman on the end that there was an open seat she could move to, and that let the guy next to me move over to the aisle seat. After that I had no issues, but good fucking god, that was probably the worst person I've ever sat next to just by default. Story 50. An extremely overweight person or a pervert. Story 51. So, I've had big guys with their elbows in my side, I've had Karens, I've had an emotional care dog, obviously not one as it barked and pissed, but the worst was having Ted Cruz be on the same flight as me. Story 52. The silent farter. Your nose gets assaulted at random times by foul odors that vary in their degrees of awfulness. Will it be rotten eggs or decaying flesh scent next? Not even the farter knows. Story 53. A chatty narcissist. Story 54. Oh my goodness, I could write a book on seatmates I've had on work travel trips, good and bad. The woman who had the pod next to mine on a flight to Sydney from LA. Our seats laid flat in the upper deck of the 747 and she crawled over me a dozen times to go to the bathroom. I offered to switch with her, she had to have a window. But her shade was down the entire flight. She ate like it was her last meal each time they served us, and her umph was her favorite reply to every single response on how much longer. I finally had enough and begged the FA to let me move, and only economy was available. The fact that I considered it speaks volumes. Anyone who sells something tends to be a tough one, and someone who has never flown before can wear me out.